Hello learners, I'm Ankita Bhattacharyya, Assistant Professor at Center for Open and Distance Learning, Tezpur University. Today in this lecture, I'm going to talk about social mobility. This lecture is primarily prepared for the learners of MA in Sociology program and the CODL Tezpur University. However, this is going to benefit anyone who is interested in learning the topic. I have kept the content very simple and easy so that it is easily comprehensible to anyone interested in learning the topic. So, what is social mobility? We know that societies are stratified and the individuals are divided into different strata or layers. However, the individuals can also move from one stratum to another, and this movement is called social mobility. So, in simple words, social mobility is the movement of individuals or groups from one social position to another. Now, in the context of mobility at the group level, we can cite the example of the upward mobility of the African Americans in the US since the end of slavery. Here, we need to understand that the more open a society is, higher will be the chances for social mobility. Let us here take the example of traditional caste-based society of India. In such a society, as we know, that one's caste is an ascribed status. Now, what is an ascribed status? A status that is fixed by birth. So here, it is very difficult, to move from one caste to another. Okay, but in an open society, we have what we call achieved status. That is, an individual acquires a social position through her or his own effort, like through merit or through hard work. So, for instance, an individual who runs a small shop can become a business tycoon through her or his efforts. Now, social mobility can be upwards or downwards. So, it can be both upwards or downwards. Either it will be a movement from a lower social position to higher position, or from a lower to a from a higher to a lower social position. Also, there can be social mobility from one social position to the another, both of which are placed at the equal level. Like, no, there will be movement, but there will be no change in the status. That will cover in the types. We'll know about that in the types of social mobility. Now, coming to the types of social mobility, there are different ways through which we can examine social mobility, and based on that, we can identify a few types of social mobility. For instance, if we examine it on the basis of the time it takes to occur, we get two forms of social mobility, that is intragenerational and intergenerational. Similarly, when we examine social mobility by factors behind the change, we get structural and circulation mobility. And if we examine it based on the direction, we get vertical and horizontal mobility. Thus, we can divide social mobility into different types. And here we are going to discuss firstly vertical and horizontal mobility. Secondly, intergenerational and intragenerational mobility, and lastly, we'll try to understand structural and circulation mobility. Now, coming to vertical and horizontal mobility. So, what do you mean by these terms, vertical and horizontal? When you hear this term, you get an idea about in which direction the mobility will be, right? Vertical will be either upward or downward, and horizontal will be sidewise, right? So this is based on the direction. This mobility, we are these two mobilities, types of mobility, that is based on the direction. Okay, so here we have got either there will be upwards or downwards mobility in the case of vertical mobility, and in the case of horizontal mobility it will be sidewise. Now let us look at the picture here. We have got two ladders. Let us consider the ladders as social ladder, and it has got different rungs, right? And I have numbered the rungs as 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. Okay, so and we have got two ladders, A and B. Now let's say like if I move from rung 1 to suppose rung 5. There is a movement, right? So that movement is upwards. Okay, and if I move from rung 5 back to rung suppose 3, okay, from 5 to 3, so there is a downward movement. Now let us take an example. Suppose I'm working as a clerk in a bank, and with promotion I got a promotion, and then I became the manager of the same bank. So here we have a mobility. It's vertical mobility. From a lower position I have moved up to a higher position. Likewise, there can be mobility downwards. Suppose I was working as a officer at an organization, and because of certain reason I had to lose the job, and the next job that I and then I had to look for a new job, right? So now I couldn't find a job of the same level, and I had to settle for a job, for a clerical job, for instance. So in that case, what happens? There is mobility, and the mobility is downward. So when there is an upward or downward movement in in the social positions, then that mobility is vertical mobility. Now if I move from, suppose, rung 4 of letter A to rung 4 of letter B, there is a movement, right? But both the rungs are at the same level. Similarly, in case of in case of social positions, if I move from one social position to another and both the social positions are at the same level, there is mobility, but that mobility is known as horizontal mobility because it is sideways. Suppose I'm working as a teacher in school A, and then I moved to school B and joined there as a teacher. Now I have mobility. There is mobility, there is social mobility, but my status or the level of the positions remain the same because I was working as a teacher, and even now I'm working as a teacher. So the level remains the same, but then there is still social mobility. So this kind of social mobility is known as horizontal mobility. Now coming to intragenerational and intergenerational mobility. On the basis of time it takes to occur, we can identify intragenerational and intergenerational mobility. Here we need to first understand these two terms, intra and inter. So why I am saying this? Because once you are clear with what these terms mean, you won't get confused, right? You won't get confused with these two forms of mobility. So what does intra mean? It means something within, right? Intra, it refers to something within. Since we are talking about intragenerational, that means it is within one generation. On the other hand, we use the prefix inter to mean between or among people or things, right? So here intergenerational means between two or more generations. Thus, when there is mobility from one social position to another within one's lifetime, then it is called intragenerational mobility. For example, when an individual gets promoted from a clerical position to a managerial position in a bank, okay, we can call that as intragenerational mobility because the person is achieving it during her or his lifetime, or we can say within the same generation. Okay. On the other hand, when there is mobility from one social position to another across generations, it is called intergenerational mobility. For example, suppose I am a clerk at a bank, and if my father was a manager when he was of my age, here we can see that there is intergenerational mobility. Of course, the mobility is downwards in this case. So we see that we need to keep in mind that intergenerational mobility or intragenerational mobility both can occur, that both of them can occur upwards as well as downwards. So this is also an example of what? Vertical mobility. Now let us look at the last form. So in this last category, we have got two forms of mobility: structural mobility and circulation mobility. Now, structural mobility, it occurs because of changes in occupational structure of a particular society, and this does not happen because of individual efforts. And since it happens because of changes in the structure and not through individual efforts, this mobility is also called as forced mobility. Now, an example that we can give here is, suppose there is the example that we can give here is that because of developments in technology, it can cut down on the requirement of manual labor. So when there is such a change, like when there is a cut down on the requirement of manual labor, definitely there will be certain mobility, like, right? So those who were working as laborers, they would have to look for some other job or some other means of livelihood. So in that case, there will be social mobility. And this kind of mobility, this structural mobility, doesn't happen at individual level. This happens at a group level. So like when there is a change in the structure, it will affect not one individual, but it will affect the entire group of individuals. So here in this case, like the entire laborers, okay, all those who were doing blue collar jobs, everyone will be affected. Now coming to the other one, that is circulation mobility. Circulation mobility occurs as a result of opening up of new opportunities that were not available before, and it is also called as true mobility. Now we know that during the 20th century, in many European countries, there was rapid growth of manufacturing employment in industries, and there was shrinking of agricultural employment. Now what did this do? This opened up new opportunities for those living in the rural areas. Okay, these opened up new opportunities, and those from the rural areas, they migrated to the urban centers because they could find new jobs, their new source of income or livelihood there. So they could give up this agricultural employment, and they can get employment in the industries. They can work there in the industries. So this social mobility happened because of the opening up of new opportunities. Likewise, these can happen also because of new laws passed or through new acts. Suppose the Equal Pay Act of 1963 in the US, that gave women the opportunity of social mobility in terms of income. So in this lecture, we have basically got a basic idea about social mobility and its different types. So we can identify different types of mobility based on different factors, okay, based on different factors, or through the way we are looking at mobility. So mobility, we know that can be either upwards or downwards, or even it can be horizontal. Secondly, we got to know that it can happen within one's lifetime, which we call as intragenerational, or it can happen across generations, that is intergenerational. Then we also got to know that there can be structural mobility as well as circulation mobility. So when there is a change in the occupational structure of a particular society, we have structural mobility, and that mobility happens at a group level, not at individual levels, and it happens not because of individual efforts but because of the changes. So it is also known as forced mobility. And then when there is opening up of new opportunities, and as a result of that, if there is mobility, that mobility we call as circulation mobility. Well, that's all I have in this lecture. Thank you.